5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff.
Sex in space. I feel like I don't need to say anything else about this episode. Jokes aside, besides sexual health being an important issue on long-duration space missions in general, one important topic is the question of reproduction in space. We touch upon all of these and more in my conversation with Simon Dubé. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University on the topic of space sexology. Enjoy.
My name is Raphael Rodkin, and I'm an investor and advisor to space companies. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. This podcast is sponsored by NanoAvionics, a satellite manufacturer and mission integrator. Their technologies enable many space companies worldwide to offer services that improve life right here on Earth, such as providing global connectivity, conducting Earth observation, or contributing to scientific discoveries. Check them out, and also check out my episode with their CEO and co-founder. Sadly, I am not a rocket scientist, but I'm an alumnus of the International Space University. ISU offers a number of educational programs about space worldwide. Check them out at isunet.edu.
And just some final things before we start the episode about ourselves. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platforms such as Apple or Spotify. If you want us help expand our work, you can do so and support us at www.patreon.com/Space Business Podcast, and we'll also put that link in the episode notes. And lastly, you can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Hey, space enthusiasts, welcome back to another episode. Today we have one of our non-business episodes, and it's actually a topic I've been wanting to discuss for a while. You may have already seen the headline. You probably have already seen the headline of the episode, so you know what I'm talking about. But I think it's actually a very interesting and a very, very important topic in space exploration. And my guest is arguably, one of the experts right now on this topic. It's Simon Dubé. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So, Simon, why don't you actually briefly introduce yourself and what you are doing?
Yes, of course. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Kinsey Institute. I'm working with Dr. Justin Garcia and Amanda Geshelman. I did my PhD at Concordia University in psychology, specializing in human sexuality, and more specifically, the study of sex tech, erobotics, so human-machine erotic interaction. And my work, which started as a side project, which became way too big for a side project now, also explore space sexology, so the study of extraterrestrial intimacy and sexuality outside of our home planet. My work, I gotta say, is funded by the Canadian Institute of Health Research, and I'm really compelled to say that this is not the work of one person, but a whole team here, also the Kinsey, but my close colleagues like Dave Anctil, Maria Santaguida, Shana Pandya, Egbert Edelbrock, and Alex Leyendecker. I'm putting their name out there right from the get-go because I'm speaking for myself today, but the work and what we'll be discussing today is a group effort as well.
Noted. And so you started out with the sexology and the interaction between humans and machines. Then you sort of segued over into space. And just to clarify, with space, is it now mostly human focused, or is there still the robot element? And I guess theoretically there could even be an alien element.
Yeah. So I think you're putting it right. It actually started with machines and human-machine erotic interaction. So a few years ago, we started looking at how technology was reshaping human intimacy and sexuality. And while we were developing the field of erobotics, we were questioning what kind of applications these technology could have in human existence. And obviously, a lot of these technology, whether that's robots, VR, augmented reality, and all the haptic equipment and stimuli that goes around with it can be used for people who don't necessarily have access to intimate partners. And they can also be used to connect people at a distance. So that's pretty good for individuals who are or maybe living in isolated, confined environment. And then with everything that was happening in the space sector, one morning the light the light bulb just opened, and it's like, what is more isolated and confined than space? And we started thinking about maybe some of these technology could be used to improve the health and well-being of astronauts, and or even maybe monitor their health. So on long-duration mission, so we wrote a little piece called "Sex in Space: Could Technology Meet the Need of Astronauts?" for the conversation, kind of asking this question and starting exploring those possibilities. And it didn't take too long before a sex tech company like WeVibe, which is now under the umbrella of Love Honey Group, noticed that and kind of asked us, like, would you be interested in expanding this line of thought in a more comprehensive report? So we did, but we realized that we were already kind of devising a solution without fully acknowledging the problem and fully studying the larger problem of what do we do with intimacy and sexuality in space. So we took a step back, and as we realized that there was a lack of research in this area, we decided to write this big position piece, which is at the same time a review, a position piece to argue for the study of space sexology, but also propose a theoretical framework and the start of a roadmap to how can we approach these questions. So now at the end of 2020, we published a case for space sexology, and in the meantime, this side project that I mentioned at the beginning became a full axis of research for me, more plainly over the course of the last 3 years.
So the pieces you've been mentioning there, these are basically articles. They're publicly available. If so, we'll link to them in the episode notes for the listeners as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two pieces that are really accessible to the lay public. They're vulgarization pieces to explain some of the work that we're doing. One of them is, like I said, Sex in Space: Could Technology Meet the Need of Astronauts? It's in the conversation. It's not a peer-reviewed article. It's really the conversation, and is a platform for researchers to convey in an op-ed style manuscript, convey some of the research and important questions to the public. There's another in the same place that's called Love and Rockets, and it's about the broader question of why we should be tackling human sexuality in space. There's also one called Me Too in Space, which I recommend. So these three pieces are in the conversation, but the case for space sexology is published in a peer-reviewed journal in the Journal of Sex Research, and there's one that's coming up this week or the next that's been accepted in Current Sexual Health Report. It's called Sexual Health in Space: A 5-Year Scoping Review, and it's really putting all the pieces together of where we are right now in this field of research and where we need to go from there in the coming years.
Okay, and so we might as well get one question out of the way. So as you mentioned, space, isolated environment, and it's obviously well known that there have been already several astronauts, male and female, who've spent significant time on the International Space Station, like over a year. So to your knowledge, or to the best of your knowledge, do you think there has been sex in space already?
The best of my knowledge, the official term is that no, hasn't been no form of sexual activities in space, whether that's solitary or partnered. So we're talking about partnered sex, or masturbation. The official word is no. I won't question that until someone speak up. But what I'll say is that it's definitely possible, and sexual responses are not inhibited completely in space. We've seen astronauts who were able to get erection. There's no reason to think that female astronauts cannot get aroused as well during space missions. Well, maybe not during a launch, because that's pretty intense, but I mean, during a long stay or any form of habituation, sexual responses doesn't seem to be inhibited, whether that's in zero gravity or reduced gravity. So we'll see in the coming years. But what is really important, I think, when someone brings this question up is it's not because it hasn't happened yet that it's not going to happen in the future. Because right now, as everyone know here, especially those who might be listening to this podcast, we're entering a greater age of space exploration, of space settlements, the development of permanent space base, but also, really importantly, the development of space tourism. So we're going to have more and more people going into space, some of them not trained astronauts that might be able to withhold abstinence or do not want to keep abstinence for long periods of time. So we might be dealing with more and more people people who either want to have sex with themselves, masturbation, or sex with their partners in more or less long duration space flights.
And it's funny you sort of made a distinction between partner sex and masturbation, because that actually would have been my next question, because I know the official line, no partner sex, but I thought, gee, if people are going up there for such a long time, maybe at least they were allowed to take along like sex tech equipment. But you're saying the official line on that is also no.
Yeah, I don't want to speculate about that. I obviously think unlikely that nothing like this happened, but at the same time, I stick to the headlines. And there's also another consideration that we need to be very mindful of. There's not many people who've been on the International Space Station. There's quite a bit of people, but because there's so few, it's important to respect their privacy. It's very easy to identify who's been in certain quarters, who's been like on certain missions. And I understand that they might not want to talk about their sexuality or reveal parts of their sexuality, but at some point, I think someone will have to acknowledge that maybe among this group of individuals, it already happened. There's some form of etiquette aboard these living quarters, because the International Space Station is a big lab, so it's a work environment. So you have to abide by work professionalism rules, but it's also a living habitat. And the International Space Station obviously is just one of the stations that's out there right now, but there'll be more and more, including commercial ones for scientific missions, for pleasure, for leisure. So at some point we have to address this problem. And I've kind of said it in multiple podcasts and interviews. If CSA, if NASA, if ESA, you're listening, I mean, we're sexual creatures, we're sexual beings, and sexuality, including masturbation, is part of an important contributor of our well-being. So deal with it.
But so just to finish up on sort of that official line, but as far as I know, it's also not the case that this is somehow artificially suppressed, right? It's not like astronauts are to our knowledge, being given any drugs which would suppress the sex drive, because people would be worried about this creating, issues in the interaction in the small confined environment.
Yeah, not to my knowledge. Obviously, I don't think they're suppressing anything. The sexual response and the possibility for masturbation or partner sex, I think, is real. There's no reason to think that that's not possible. For partnered sex in low gravity, we might need some form of garments or strap-ons or just like pieces of equipment to keep people close from one another. For masturbation, I mean, we might want to be thinking about some hygiene, obviously, not services, but technical components. And I'll throw that out there. Some people make it, I think, more complicated than it is. It could be a sex toy, it could be by hand, but maybe just a condom or something that could contain, for instance, for male sperm. You don't want that. Like, you want to keep a viable habitat. Like, that's a practical reality that we need to address. For female, you also want to have some form of cleaning equipment as well, to even like with general bodily fluids. So right now it's more practically the solution are actually pretty simple, I think. But the question is more, how are we going to deal with that? With multiple people living in small quarters, and to infuse like a respectful way of acknowledging everyone's needs, their preferences, and acknowledging and be respectful with one another. We kind of need to help astronauts and future space inhabitants to be respectful of one another, develop a proper ethics of sex and communication and etiquette aboard these space habitats.
Yeah. So this is a good segue, is because I basically now wanted to delve a little bit deeper and actually ask you about, so like what are some examples of your specific lines of research that you're pursuing in this, big topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, like I said, we had to kind of come back to the basics in the beginning, do our own homework, and some reviews and cultural research had already been done from at multiple times in history. There was already call for this kind of research 30 years ago, and more recently by colleagues like Alex Leyen-Decker and Shana Pandya. And it's not that people have not said this is important or not reviewed some of the literature at their time, but it seemed again needed that we need to bring where we were at. So that's what we started by doing, a review a call for research, starting to put, like I said, a roadmap in place of how can we go about it, because it's great to say that there's a lack of research, but if you don't tell people, look, you might want to explore these directions and maybe we can have this common language and these concepts and these views of who could be involved in this research, it seems more like a great idea and an important idea, but at some point you need some practical components to how can we conduct this scientific endeavor. So that's where we started. But right now what we're working on is analog missions. So we are really right now in a two-stage process of kind of launching analog study. The first one is really empirical papers, retrospective papers of people's sexual health and intimacy in analog context, but thinking about when they were in the past in analog missions. So we're going to sample the analog community to think about, did you have a partner? Did you experience sexual arousal? Were you attracted to your partners? What were your sexual health using standardized questionnaires? So it's a first base of retrospective sample. That's not perfect because it's not in the moment, but usually these kinds of studies are really good to say, look, people are aroused, people sometimes were frustrated sexually, it affected their mental health and mood. They wish they could have masturbated or they experienced desire towards their colleague. It gives us already an idea that there's something that's going on. And from talking to analog astronauts informally, I can tell you, there's some stuff that's going on. The next phase of these questionnaire studies is actually going to be with actual analog missions. So there's a few coming up. Well, there's always a few studies going on in the world, but there's also the world's biggest analog that's happening in maybe 2025, I think, but we need to apply in advance. But regardless of that, with colleagues like Emilia Polonio at High Seas and their Interstellar Performance Lab company, what we want to do is take measures of their sexual health, subjective and objective, before they get into missions, during missions, and after missions. So we want to know, for example, what's their sexual responses like, what's the status of their sexual health, how it relates to their psychological health, their anxiety, depression, stress, before, during, and after an analog. So that's where we're starting. And I think that's a good point because obviously more and more people are getting trained, more and more people, a lot of the science behind space research is done here on Earth. Obviously, it's not all about the International Space Station or flights or whatnot. We can do really cool and important research here on Earth in these isolated, confined, and extreme environments. So that's where we're starting. Whenever we have good partners, with hopefully the space agencies, we can do more in-depth analysis. Maybe they've already done it and they just keep the data for themselves for privacy, again, reason, which I would totally understand. But hopefully we can also do interviews, in-depth interview with astronauts. We can do similar kind of research with astronauts and the kind of mission that right now NASA is doing, simulation of Mars for a year. I think these would be really valuable and important data about how sexual health influence mental health and how it influenced then these two, mental and sexual health, influence crew cohesion, crew performance, and ultimately mission success. I think if you really wanted thinking about in a mission kind of state, not just we're living in space, but in really how are we going to settle Mars or do long duration space flight, you need to be thinking about these questions. Like I've said again in many interviews, I'm not worried about astronauts lacking hair or food or that a big system will fail and then ultimately it's going to be a catastrophic event because there's so many redundant systems and protocols in place. I'm worried about someone snapping. I'm really worried about someone being sexually frustrated, someone sexually assaulting someone, gender harassment, someone just missing their partner at home for long periods of time and wanting to express their sexuality in a healthy way. These are the kind of concerns I'm having. They're human factors, concerns. I don't know if it's derived from sci-fi or just my psychological training, but again, I'm not worried about a system failing. I'm worrying about the human system failing.
Yes, the human factor. And there's actually, it's funny you mentioned sci-fi. I was just going to say, I'm totally blanking on the name, but there's a relatively recent sci-fi movie where they're sending a bunch of basically teenage kids basically for settlement to another planet. And they're all on, without knowing, they're all on like sex drive suppressant drugs, but then they find out they're on drugs and they stop taking the drugs, and it's not pretty. Let's put it this way. But anyway, let me ask.
That movie that you're talking about obviously is not what's going to happen, but I'd like to say that what was interesting is that suppressing that part of ourselves is not a viable option.
Yes.
And rather we should just learn how to integrate it into just a meaningful way and a safe way of going about space exploration.
Agreed. So let's flesh out a little bit more some of the sort of research you're working on that you've mentioned with the analog missions. And so right now, is this mostly with the questionnaires and then maybe in the future also with observations? Is that mostly sort of data collections, or do you already have some sort of specific hypotheses in mind you want to investigate?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, it is absolutely questionnaire based. We're in the process of fleshing out those investigation, developing the right partnerships, anticipating the right missions, and applying for ethics. Right now, it is a process that takes time, especially because we're outsiders. We're coming from outside of the space sector, looking in. We are psychologists, sexologists, coming in and doing these kinds of research. So we want to establish ourselves, and we've been trying to do this the right way. Like, here's the literature review, here's the questionnaire studies, here's then the empirical, and we do have some hypotheses. One of them, obviously, is at baseline that analog mission will influence sexual responses and sexual health, which will then predict mental health as well. But the more precise hypothesis has to do with time, I would say. I think a lot of people are really able to endure long periods of isolated and confined environments without too much impact on so when we see, for example, a 1 week, 2 week maybe of analog, I think most people are able to withstand this period of time. That said, they definitely have sexual responses, especially during these times. Their sexual arousal, the excitement as well of the beginning of these missions, collaborating with new people, the sexual response and attractiveness component with their partner who share common values and common shared spirit of adventure and discovery and exploration. It generally creates bonds quite rapidly. So we want to experience that good side and study that good side of things. But when we think about, negative impacts of these environment or detrimental effects of HICE environment, isolated, confined, and extreme, sometimes certain people react to it, I think, quite rapidly. But what previous studies have shown on psychological, it takes more time. I would say around a month, you start to see some effects, probably around cortisol and other biomarkers of stress. Definitely after 6 months. It's actually often the midway point, depending on a mission, of 8 to 12 months. Around 6 months, people start to disorganize much more. So I would expect that these same psychological effects you would see also partly affecting in a bidirectional manner sexual responses and sexual health. But that being said, we'll have to start with smaller analog missions because funding and doing with multiple astronauts and multiple crews, because you need a big enough sample to draw these conclusions. For long duration, it's going to take time. And like I said, we're outsiders trying to get this research not only funded, but developing the right partnerships with space agencies. So we're starting small, but we are a growing network of researchers interested in these questions. And I think we've seen, for example, more interest, I think, for NASA in 2022. For the first time, they said, look, if we identify that reproduction in space or reproductive health in space is a problem or an issue, we're going to invest the necessary resources into studying it. I think after some of our papers and what's coming up in the coming years, it's going to be difficult to say that it's not an issue. And we've already seen, I think they're kind of doing it in some ways, because ESA published I think it's kind of a series of white paper, and then it was summarized in scientific publication about reproduction in space. So they're kind of touching on the subject, but Now we need to get down to the relational level and these analog missions. So I hope that kind of answers your question. But right now we want to look at what's the roadmap of mission that's coming up in the coming years to the moon, to Mars, to these things, and tourism effect, and say, here are the time that people spend in space. Here are the kind of habitats that they start in space. We need to replicate that and pinpoint where people struggle, where people fare well, what kind of measures or kind of countermeasures, to be more specific, can help. For example, if you say to people, well, for the next 3 weeks or for the next month, you're going to have to abstain yourself from any sexual activities, including masturbation, fine, the person can say, yes, I'm doing it. And then how does this affect people? But then we want to see, look, here's a crew who actually were able to masturbate. And maybe they masturbated 2 or 3 times. Maybe some people, it was 2 or 3 times a week. Others was once during the month. We want to see if that actually alleviates some of the burden. So it's not just about establishing what are the issues and relationship between mental health, sexual health, crew performance. It's also, can we just accept or enable people to do these things and put in place good procedures and technical support for people to express their eroticism? And does that actually prevent any problem from arising? So these are the kind of logical steps that we're taking to conduct these kinds of research.
Yeah. And I'm going to come back to sort of the last thing you said there, sort of almost like a briefing for people before they go on a mission, especially in the tourist context. But just coming back to the analog mission. So, I mean, I think we've been talking basically mostly about analog astronaut missions, right? And those are well known. But it's another thing. I mean, a lot of the elements you're trying to research here, it's basically about sort of long-term confined situations and potentially being abstinent. But are there not any other sort of precedents on Earth? For example, we've had, I think, for many years, people crews spending the Antarctic winter, holed up at relatively small research camps. Is there anything, I don't know, any studies from there, any knowledge we have from these types of situations?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's coming out more and more, what is happening in these stations, and it's not pretty. It is encouraging. Not only the levels of depression after the midway point, the level of anxiety, but there's a recent USAP report about some of the Antarctic missions that came out. That was studies conducted by a third party, but commissioned by the National Science Foundation, that shows the levels of sexual harassment and sexual assault in these Antarctic mission it's unprecedented. 72% of women said they've been sexually harassed during their mission, or they say that it's a problem in these environments. And around 40% said that sexual assault is a problem during these missions. They've not necessarily said that they've been, but some of these survivors have talked and been interviewed and say it's well known that women get sexually harassed or even assaulted on these missions. How can we accept that? These are scientific missions and these things. And to me, it's a kind of prime example of there's a huge blind spot. There's a blind spot in the way we teach people to go there, how the kind of etiquette, the kind of systems in place that when you're in a small group, you don't have a lot of recourse. Maybe your superior is someone you depend on. How do you report problems? If you have to abort a mission, how do you do that? How do you get out of a situation? How do you make sure that people are safe? These problems that we're seeing on Earth, we're going to see in space. And yes, some of our research and most of our research focuses on more or less long duration spaceflight, but cases of gender and sexual-based harassment, they happen not just on long duration spaceflight. They could happen on a much shorter mission or space flight in general, whether that's for tourism or scientific missions. We still need to consider that. We have data, like you said, of what's going on Earth. Not enough, in my opinion, really not enough, but we have already some indication that there's a problem. There's many problems. And one of them that I really want to stress to space agencies but also generally scientific organizations is that this is what we see in our daily life also is exacerbated sometimes in these extreme conditions. And if we don't do anything about it now, it's going to hurt people, but it's also going to, if you want to think it about like a very business, ethical or legal way, you're going to get sued. You're going to be held liable eventually or responsible for these nightmares. So why not just kind of address it from the get-go? It's difficult, like, to say how many problems there are. One way that I try to explain it at conferences or during interviews is that take all the issues that we have with our intimacy and sexuality on Earth, multiply it by the conditions of living in space, and then multiply this by time. And then you get an idea of the magnitude of the problem. And in relation to what's going on in Antarctica, there's in scientific missions, it's not just that there's cases of sexual harassment or sexual assault. We also see women giving birth a few months after coming back from these missions. And they've been there for many months. Like, it's pretty clear that some stuff happened. Hopefully it was consensual and based on, I don't know, desire to have children or love or whatever the reason they might have, that's fine, but something's going on. And there's no reason to suspect that this will not be somewhat similar in space context.
Yeah. So Antarctica was one sort of parallel that sprung to my mind. The other one, which is even more sinister, but again, I can see some parallels, is sort of like prison inmates on Earth.
Yeah.
And that, of course, also has, I guess, very high rate of harassment and things like that. I don't know if there have been studies on
prison,
that.
Obviously is a different context. I think it's a good way of asking these questions, but at the same time, there's very specific realities to prison, so I tend to not use them as an analogy because of putting together in a very specific kind of unhealthy environment that is not really designed to favor their needs, but actually restrain their rights and restrain their access to a limited number. A lot of people who have psychological problems, criminal past, antisocial behaviors, antisocial personality, psychopathic personality. And then you're putting all of these people in a small environment, a great number. I don't know what people are expecting, how this is going to happen, but I like to draw a comparison with Antarctica and submarines. We also have many cases in the military of cases of sexual harassment. We have also cases of more positive things in submarines and way of living, that there's not a formal but informal rules and some etiquettes, some sexual etiquettes in military and submarines. We have indication that, for example, the use of pornography, some sex toys, some stimulation in submarines and is accepted, and not formally. And I don't know if many military or personnel would confirm what I'm saying here, but we have indication that they've kind of developed some systems of, we have sexual needs. We're here together for long periods of times. So there's ways to express your sexuality in a healthy way in your living quarters. I think we can learn a lot from that for space endeavors. But we also need, again, to address the problem, because sexual harassment and gender-based harassments and cases of anti-LGBTQ movements in the military is extremely prevalent. So, yeah.
That's actually interesting. I haven't thought about this, to be honest. But submarines, that strikes me as very interesting, because if we hopefully some point in time in the next few decades, we get to these like interplanetary type missions that Elon Musk has in mind, that probably be like a similar crew size, similar space and all of that. So that's quite interesting. By the way, apart from the sort of the missions you've described and the research you've described, if you had sort of unlimited funding, what would be your ideal sort of like dream study?
My dream study would probably have something to do with studying this process while we're going to Mars and doing kind of a multi-site study of multiple ships with people on Earth, with people in space, with people in base, then establishing a full settlement and seeing it would be a multi-year generational study of how can we adapt in our sexuality and practices and develop trainings based on that knowledge and try to train astronauts to anticipate that. It would be very comprehensive, but a more realistic. If I had access to fund, I would probably build my own analog stations. I would try to connect it with the world's biggest analog and try to see what can we do with different crew size? So I would have like an analog environment where I can have more than 4 to 8 individuals. I would try to bring it maybe to 30 sometimes, and just where I have multiple camps, and really take all the measures that we like to have here in psychophysiology, whether they're subjective arousal, their sexual history, and then when they watch porn or they are sexually stimulated, we take their genital measurements. Then we allow them to have or not partnered sex, masturbation, and whatnot, and just compare the groups on how is their experience? Do they feel better about that? Does that improve their morale? Does that improve their crew cohesion? I would also look at crew dynamics, a lot of crew dynamics and power dynamics. That's what I'm really also quite worried about, is you depend on each other. You really depend on each other. So if your commander is also your chief medical officer or your pilot, or he's just your commander, you just need him like to lead. But you fall in love and then you break up, or there's perceived conflict of interest. How does that affect the crew, affect the individuals? How people who or just attracted to each other and have sex in these kinds of mission affect other people's perception. For example, maybe they accept that 2 people have sex, but afterwards it's like, does someone have some privilege? How do you maintain discipline? How do you maintain cohesion for the mission's sake in these environments? I've been asked a few times, like, what would you suggest? I think we need to train people to talk about their sexual needs, to be respectful of the etiquette. But I also actually want to propose that we build these kinds of erotic friendships and an understanding of erotic friendships, so that crews in many ways are sexual friendly and sexual friends and sex positive. So you might want to be thinking about multi-partnered erotic interactions and stuff like that, or take good advice from the consensual non-monogamy community, whether that's to allow, for example, I'm married, I have a partner and children at home, but I have to go on a 3-year mission. How do you talk to your partner about these things, and to your crew members, and what kind of what do you accept in terms of partnered sex? Touch and intimacy and connection with others is so important to our well-being. We need to kind of be mature about this, more mature and less conservative that we are about that, to enable something. So I would run studies with unlimited funding. I would run studies testing all of these aspects.
Yeah. So let me ask you another question. So we've been talking about the studies part. Let's cross over more into something, let's call it prescriptive. Let's say, one of the companies that's engaged in space tourism, or whether it's SpaceX or Axiom or Orbit or somebody like that, basically wants to take people up to on capsules or even space stations in the future. They call you and they're like, Simon, we got a group of people here. They're going to go up to space. There's a couple of married couples here. We need some sort of like intimacy or whatever you want to call it briefing. Oh, yeah. What do you think? What do you think? Maybe some of the key messages you would give them.
The key messages: sexual communication is key. Respect of each other's needs is key. Hygiene and maintaining a viable habitat is key. That's what I would say to the clients. But I would say to the space organization, get ready for some solitary or partnered sex. So just provide them with the right tools to maintain a viable habitats, depending on how your capsule or whatever you're sending is structured. The space architecture component is actually really important. How do you maintain privacy, hygiene, and aside from that, my last question is always, what do you do if it's a problem? And I'm taking it 2 kinds of problem. What do you do if someone gets hurt? What do you do if there's a problem of sexual harassment? How do you deal with that? Are you just going to take the problematic perpetrator and just isolate them from the other and then bring it back to her? Like, how are you going to deal with that? What's your game plan? If someone says, if someone gets raped, or if someone removes consent in the sexual interaction, or if someone for some reason does something weird in microgravity and, I don't know, like breaks his penis, or just has genital pain, or bangs their head on whatever. Like, what are you going to do if a problem arises? And I want you to have a clear game plan. And to be fair, space organizations are super risk averse. they are super risk averse. And that's why I think they fear sex, because they feel like sex is something chaotic that cannot be controlled and there's problems going to be arise. But I'm there to tell you, there are plenty of solutions. We can address it, but just we need to bring the experts. And I would say also bring more experts than me. There's plenty of people who are sex coach, psychotherapists, sexologists, sex therapists, name it, gynecologists, obstetrician. There's plenty of people. I would also say, especially at this stage, make sure that women and female are on contraceptive, because one thing that's going to happen, eventually somewhere in the nation, they'll want to have the first baby conceived in space, not just for the pride of fun, but plenty of other reasons. Maybe just want a celebrity or the first. We need to address the reproductive component, but in the meantime, we're not there yet. So I would just say sexual health is key. Everyone's tested, everyone's great, and make sure that there's contingency plan in place.
Yeah, we'll get back to the reproduction in a minute, because I think that's just such an important question. But the other question I want to ask before that is, which you've mentioned maybe 20, 30 minutes ago already, is sort of like the more mechanical part, right? Sort of like, how much work has been done on sort of like, how can good sexual activity be had just mechanically, in terms of having, we're having like obviously specialized sports equipment already on the space stations, right? I assume there would have to be sort of like similar types of adaptations of, sleeping quarters or some other equipment. And I guess that's where you started. You mentioned you started sort of like more on the sex tech side. So to what extent are people already working on things like that?
Yeah, it's really a good question. Living in space requires technology. So why not also apply the same logic to our sexuality? And you said sports equipment. You're absolutely right. And living quarters, I'm glad you mentioned it, because I know people who live in space, for those who might not know, they're kind of in little quarters with sleeping bags and whatnot. These sleeping bags, it's already pretty good to keep people close if we're thinking about partnered sexual activities. It's also pretty good for solitary partnered sex. It is quite confined. It's cleanable. It's relatively easy to maintain. It's not like your bed sheet at home, maybe, but because much more complicated. But at the same time, it's already pretty cozy and pretty well organized. But of course, you could think of other more efficient garments and straps and contraptions, and maybe piece of clothes. That Vanabanta suit is the very famous example. They've tried testing it in parabolic flights to see if they were able to stay together, and they were to some extent. I just want to be clear that the test that they've done in parabolic flight is already pretty difficult to do the whole process in 30 seconds within these segues. So actually, I thought their solution was pretty elegant and good. It's just that it's difficult to show that it works, because they don't have a lot of time to make it work. Like if they were on the space station and have all the time in the world in total weightlessness. There's not a lot of people who are working on these realities. There are people that I know that are working and asking questions to us on the space architecture front. I think that's quite important and interesting. I've been told that people who were interns at NASA, they were system engineers, and they wanted to propose some technology for that, and their advisor just said, no, you cannot study that. This is not going to fly. Don't do this. You'll just get ridiculed and nothing is going to get funded. But that was a few years ago. I hope it changed. I think one clever way that NASA and any other people could go about it, if they don't want to say, oh, it's for sex, they don't want to have anything to do, because they don't want to say to Congress, oh, we've been thinking about this. We're using taxpayers' dollars or investors' money to fund sex, which in my opinion is ridiculous. It's a huge market, and there's a need for that. But if that's your stance, I completely understand it. What I think is clear is that you can say that it's for many other stuff. Oh, the sleeping bag there for sleep, obviously, or these living quarters there for, oh, we need to have a private environment. But then you take into account the possibility that partnered or solitary sex would arrive in the design without necessarily mentioning it. But I think if you don't, you're just gunning for problems in the future, and people getting hurt or just making the environment less habitable or less viable. I think people in space agencies are some of the smartest people on Earth. They're quite aware of these these realities, sometimes they just don't say it out loud. But we have good indication from people working in these that they are somewhat aware, or when they're aware that there's a problem, they're kind of asking the right people the question, for example, on the design of a room or the design of an habitat. So they're taking that into consideration. I just wish it was not that taboo and stigmatized. I just wish it was in the open that we're sexual being. Everyone on here on Earth is the results of a reproductive cycle or some form of sexuality and intimacy. And this is not going to change in space. So why not just acknowledge it out loud?
Yeah, absolutely agree. And, if the space agencies will keep it taboo for a longer time, I agree with something you said earlier, which is just the private space tourism industry. I mean, there's just no way you can ignore that, because there's going to be couples increasingly going to space. But so the other thing we've been indirectly touching upon a few times now, I want to ask you about, which frankly for me is the question, and frankly, actually one of the most important questions in all space explorations. Like we're talking a lot about making, well, some of us, including prominent people like Elon, are talking a lot about making life multiplanetary or expanding to other places. And I feel the question that gets almost no airtime and seems to be largely ignored is like, well, how much do we know about having babies under non-1G normal gravity conditions? Because for me, there is no more human activity than reproducing, right? And it's like, I don't see humanity wanting to live in other places if you can't have families. So in many ways for me, and people can disagree with this may be the most important question in all of sort of like human space exploration. And I haven't seen a lot of research done, answers, conclusions. What are you seeing?
Yeah, you're asking also the absolutely right question. And just before we get into the nitty-gritty of what kind of research is being done, there's a person, his name was Michael Lane a few years ago. He said, reproduction in space is the way we're going to become independent from Earth. So there's no space exploration without reproduction. Otherwise, we're just going to stay confined to where we are right now. To be fully autonomous in space, we need to figure out how to have multi-generational reproduction outside of Earth and outside of our solar system. So that's the magnitude of the challenge that we're dealing here. Space exploration is dependent on humanity figuring out how to reproduce in outer space. So it is actually the area that is most studied, partly because of the magnitude of the problem. Secondly, because you can do a lot of it with non-human models, with animals, basically. So since actually the 60s, there's been many studies using rats, using reptiles, using fish, so actually sex in space happened in space, but with non-human animals, with quails, with birds, name it, with geckos, and a lot of mice. That said, there's not been yet full cycles of reproduction in space, multi-generational. What we often do is either they reproduce here on Earth, or we take samples of sperms and ovas, and then we send it into space or use simulators on Earth to see how microgravity or radiation doses affect the gametes and the cells. Or when we implant them in fertile females, then does that lead to healthy pups, healthy generations? Or other questions that we've been asking and studying, and great studies by Wakayama and their team over the past few years. They were able to store frozen sperm for long periods of time, almost the equivalent of 5 years, without any DNA damage. And they were able to produce viable offspring afterwards on Earth. We were able to store them on the International Space Station. So there is actually a lot of, not a lot, but a significant amount of research on reproduction in space, whether that's actually in space or in simulation environment here on Earth. The main questions and main findings that we're finding, and that if you want to know, dear listeners, just read our 5-year scoping review on sexual health in space that's coming out recently, not the next 1 or 2 weeks in Current Sexual Health Report. It summarizes all of that research of the past 5 years exactly on these questions. What we know is that, okay, reproduction and microgravity, it's a problem. It is really a problem. Radiation obviously cause all kinds of DNA damage, which trickles down afterwards to cancer, developmental anomalies, problems. Microgravity tends to affect also blood flow. It tends to affect also how the gametes navigate. It seems to be possible to reproduce under microgravity, and the implementation of embryos seems to function. But the full development afterwards seems to require a standard 1G. We and all the other species that exist on Earth have evolved under very specific conditions, so we're adapted to that. The kind of condition that we have in space is we really have to shield from radiation, and we have to, ideally for humans, especially eventually for human development, we need probably to simulate 1G gravity or some form of artificial gravity. We have indication that reduced gravity seems not to be such a problem. For example, maybe even Mars or Mars type of gravity might be okay. But again, we have very, very, very little information compared to our capabilities to navigate or build vehicles in space and viable habitats. We've invested much, much less into human factors and especially reproduction. So at this stage, I think everyone kind of needs a wake-up call of this is happening. We're going into space. We're sending more and more people that are not necessarily trained. And eventually there might be some people who want to reproduce, and we have to on a long period of time. But even before that, there might be cases of we want to make sure that radiation doesn't affect people's gametes, people's sperms, people's ability to reproduce on Earth. For example, for now, we have really good reasons to think that short stays, a few days or not, no problem. In the future, if we find other studies, I want to say don't hold me to that statement. We might discover that it creates other problem. I acknowledge that. I'm really talking about our state of knowledge right now. For small duration, it seems to be okay. For long duration, there's an increased risk. When we're talking about 2 or 3 year missions to Mars, I really don't know, but it'll definitely need good radiation shielding at baseline, good equipment, and a space company like SpaceX, good insurances, good legal contract with your astronauts, because and they need to be aware, they need to have informed consent, like this presents a risk for my future reproductive possibilities. Maybe they'll decide we're going to try to send people who've already had their children or have frozen sperm and ovas and they've frozen their gametes or whatnot in cells, make sure that they can reproduce in the future. I think that would be a smart way of going about it if they think they might want to have children. For women, the risks are also quite unknown, but there's plenty of evidence that it is going to get problematic, and that in many ways, female might be more sensitive to the female reproductive system, seems to be more sensitive in certain area, much more complex in many ways than the male system. So we need to also acknowledge these realities and the fact that in our species, female are the ones who are carrying children. So that also has plenty of other ethical and social impacts. So,
so it seems like a lot of work left to be done on this important question. A lot of PhD theses still up for grabs.
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you're a PhD student and you're wondering what kind of research you want to be doing in the space sector, there's a huge field of space sexology that is untapped. It's a blue ocean market. Jump on it. Right now, reproduction is, and the effects of space environment is the most studied. But even in that most studied area, we've barely scratched the surface.
Understood. Simon, as we're sort of winding down here on the podcast, the last question we traditionally always ask on every episode is on science fiction and sort of your favorite science fiction. But since we're talking about this very specific topic, if you want, you could also sort of like pick out, depictions of sex in space that spring to mind. I've been trying to think about it, and stuff that came to my mind is, I think in Red Mars, Kim Stanley Robinson on the way to Mars, there's some sex going on. I think in Vernon Vinge's novels, they have some sex in Microgravity, and it's basically a mess. But yeah, what is some of your favorite science fiction? And if you want to highlight the sex parts, then feel free.
Yeah, I mean, the first one that comes to mind is The Expanse. I think that was a good show. I think there's a few sex scene as well. But what actually also comes to mind when I think about The Expanse is also there's a few crews that seem to have a very positive sex ethics and kind of are in love or in an erotic relationship with one another. I thought that was quite interesting. And maybe a kind of consensual non-monogamy style of relationship that might be warranted more exploration. But aside from that, I mean, recently, just for a conference at South by Southwest, we had just tallied how many relationship, I think Captain Kirk or something, William Shatner's had in terms of relationships in space. So it was not like scenes of sex, but you had dozens of partners in space over the course of the captain's career in Star Trek. And it just kind of brings to mind that, look, we've been thinking about this for so long. It's very strange as a species that one of the first and most primal important aspect of our life is sex, but it always ends up being the last that we study, the last that we address. And fortunately and unfortunately, when we actually do, usually it creates innovation. It creates social innovation. It creates new ideas. It creates new frameworks and way of thinking. I think I think actually, if sometimes we invested more in thinking about our sexual and intimate relationship, we would uncover many other form of social dynamics and ways of going about it to address in complex environments. So just circling back to the science fiction, there's just so many sex scenes in space, and we've been thinking about this for quite a bit of time. So why not just now really address it now that science is reaching back to fiction nowadays?
Totally agreed. Simon, thank you so much for coming on again. I think the work that you and all the others that you mentioned at the very beginning are doing is super important, and it's absolutely crucial to us, expanding humanity into space. So thanks for coming on and talking about it. And we'll link to some of your articles in the episode notes.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me again.
Well, that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving it a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Also consider supporting us at www.patreon.com/spacebusinesspodcast. If the podcast got you interested in learning more about the business opportunities in the space economy, check out my new online course on space entrepreneurship on udemy.com. The link is in the episode description. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to seeing you for the next episode.